Well, thank you for welcoming me and for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's a very special pleasure to be back in Arkansas because the Incremental Development Alliance is almost 3 years old now, and we've worked all across the country in about 3 dozen cities or a little bit more, and haven't been in Arkansas very often. Our second workshop was in Bentonville, and this is the first time we've been back to Arkansas. So Arkansas will be my 10th city to deliver this workshop in the last couple of years since I've been involved, and I'm just thrilled to be back here. The Incremental Development Alliance, what we do is exactly what Tab just described. We help cities develop local cohorts of small developers that can rebuild their neighborhoods under local ownership and local action. And we find that whenever we go to cities with these workshops and our message, that everywhere we go is just absolutely ready for these kinds of trainings, because they've been trying to figure out how they can take some of their older neighborhoods or their more beloved neighborhoods that may be stable but a little bit struggling, and figure out how they can restore them to their former glory. And what we teach so much is that outside developers really aren't coming until the market is super hot. And if you want to figure out how to get that work done, you have to establish a local cohort of developers. So we've done this, I've done this. I've been in San Antonio, in Greensboro, North Carolina. Been out to Las Vegas and Orlando and Nebraska. And our clients for this kind of work are oftentimes much like the team that's been assembled here, but sometimes they're brokerages, sometimes they're large developers that are looking to stimulate a local group that can do the kinds of follow-on projects or pre-development projects that make it possible for them to deliver the big stuff. We work with just about everybody, and we do that across a couple of different kinds of programs. One is the workshop that we'll deliver here on May 31st, and that typically looks a little bit like this. We put people through their paces. We make them experience the emotional roller coaster that is development. And we also work directly with cities in what we call stress tests, where we put city councilors and planners and other elected and appointed officials through the paces of small development using the codes they already have on the books, so they understand how those codes actually are implemented on the ground and what their functional relationship is with development, in addition to their explicit relationship. And we often find in cities that there are a lot of obviously unintended consequences with those kinds of codes, and so that can sometimes be the genesis of them coming back and doing some major revisions. So let's get into it a little bit. Today, this is a lecture, just like it was described, to tell you more about what we do during the workshop. And the hope today is, how we measure success for this lecture is, if you understand what our intentions are after this and what the curriculum will be, that you might go out and recruit some other people to come to the workshop, the right people for your community. And the right people are the folks that are walking around your city already, and they're seeing the vacant lot or the depreciated storefront or the cottages that could use a little bit more curb appeal, and they say, well, somebody ought to do something there. Maybe I should do something there. And that's what we think. We think that those people that say somebody ought to do something are the right people to come to these workshops. And a lot of people think that way, right? You've probably fantasized about some of those projects on your own, and if you have, you're exactly who we want there. But also, if you are a member of the ecosystem of development, if you touch development in any way, whether that's through entitlements and enforcements or lending or brokerage or contracting, you might want to be there as well, because what we believe is that it's not enough just to have people who are interested in development. You really have to establish a whole ecosystem to support the kind of development you're looking for. And that's especially important for the kinds of development that we're talking about, the fine-grained kind of development. This is the way we usually think of development. This is how we think of development all over the country. If there's this kind of fear, this narrative that if we see things like this, that our downtowns and our neighborhoods will turn into Manhattan. That's not actually true. We don't see that happen very often, right? But that's the narrative in a lot of people's minds. We also are very familiar with the kind of subdivision development. And it turns out that in most places there are ecosystems already set up to allow subdivisions and to allow this kind of mixed-use stuff. And if you're in the giant Shark Tank of Manhattan, you can get stuff like that done too. The problem is there's almost no ecosystem remaining for the fine-grained stuff that we know and love, that we'd like to be able to build again. The middle-scaled stuff just doesn't get built at all. And that's for a couple of reasons. There aren't really financial products that are out there for it, or at least not well-known financial products. The zoning and development codes that most of our cities have on the books, and I haven't done a deep dive on Conway's codes, but I would wager that you have some challenges in your codes just like other cities, that even if they don't make this kind of stuff expressly illegal, they make it functionally illegal. And so changing this narrative and finding how to do this middle-scale stuff is really what we are trying to tackle. Whether we're working directly with ecosystem partners like the city, like lenders or brokers, or when we're actually training would-be small-scale developers on the nuts and bolts. The challenge of our time, and this time in particular, makes the opportunity incredibly ripe, and for a couple of reasons. Here's one. This is sourced from, I've actually got an updated figure here. This is still true as of the last American Housing Survey in 2013 done by the U.S. Census Bureau. 29% of all our housing stock has 4 or more bedrooms across the country. And about 2/3 of all our housing stock has 2 or more bathrooms. Okay, now why do I tell you this? Well, it's for this reason. This was shocking to me when I learned it. To me, this is a kind of red pill fact. Once you learn this, you can't go back into the matrix. 83%. So this figure comes from some research done by a researcher named Arthur Nelson. He's now at Arizona State University. When he did this research, he was at University of Utah, and it's been corroborated by extremely progressive, out there groups like the National Association of Realtors and RCLCO, an analysis group for big real estate firms. 83%. Now, when Professor Nelson pulled this number out and started talking about it in his book, is excellent, Reshaping Metropolitan America. You got to read it. He was in Utah, where there are some big families in Utah. And they said, well, Mr. Nelson, you got to be kidding us. This is Utah. We got to be different. And he says, okay, let me go back. Let me run the numbers. I got all your data. You guys are our metro. We got good census data for you. And he came back and said, you know what? You're right. It is different. The number is 79% for you. So every race is a little bit different, but it's not all that different. Hendricks has a lot of education institutions. Fayetteville's a university city as well. You might see that this number might actually be a little bit higher for you for that reason, but in general, this is the trend of where things are going. And it's already apparent on the ground today. Today, about 2/3 of all of the households across the United States only have 1 or 2 people in them. 1 or 2 people in them. So if 2/3 of people today only have 1 or 2 people in them, why is this the case? Why do so many of these places have 2 or more bathrooms, or 3 or 4 bedrooms, or more bedrooms? Well, to answer that question, I think it's complicated. It's not simple, but we can point to a couple of things. Those kinds of places are very easy to finance. They're relatively easy to construct according to our codes, and so the bullseye, the target that we have put out there that real estate developers are able to hit is very specific, and it tends to be at the extreme ends of the housing spectrum. It's relatively easy. I'm not saying it's simple, but it's relatively easy to build a single-family home or maybe even a duplex. It's relatively easy to build a bunch of those in a subdivision, and it's relatively easy, once you get through the chaos of understanding how to do it, to finance and contract a larger apartment building. The scale is there to justify the headache of moving through those kinds of processes. The scale is not there for the middle scale development. And this can be a real problem because middle scale development is what makes up all of these places in our cities, right? These are the kinds of places we cherish. These are the kinds of places that make a destination worth living in. And it's an incredible variety of places, right? It's not a complete neighborhood if you just have a good elementary school. It's not a complete neighborhood if you just have a good park or if you just have a dozen different bars. You have to have all of these things, even though places that don't have all these things might still be judged as economically successful. It's pretty clear that they're not reaching their full potential until you have the full spectrum of destinations, both on the commercial side and housing choices for the people that might choose to live there. When we were walking down around downtown Conway, and I always make a habit of walking around downtown whenever I'm here, so I've probably walked the same, I'm not extraordinarily familiar, but the same 7 or 8 blocks of downtown Conway a couple dozen times. Over the last decade or so. And the changes that have been happening here have been really inspiring. Now, it doesn't mean that downtown Conway doesn't need improvement, but it does mean that in downtown and in other neighborhoods in Conway and in other neighborhoods in Arkansas, most towns in Arkansas have this exact same problem. They only have a couple of these things, and they especially don't usually have housing. Without housing, these things become anomalies that you choose to visit instead of a part of your casual life. And it's that kind of difference, the difference between something you have to make plans to do and a neighborhood that you don't have to make plans in, that we are trying to restore, and that it seems like cities are really interested in restoring. And that's what middle-scale buildings provide. So this is what we think of whenever we think of as incremental development. I want to be really clear, this is zero to 3 stories, because sometimes you don't have enough of a market to support construction. Sometimes you have to do something else to prove the market. It's mostly residential because cities are mostly residential. The new bar, or the new trampoline park, or aquatic park, or library, or whatever it might be, is a really kind of sexy idea, right? That's boosterism for our cities as we've known it for as long as we've been boosting and trying to promote the cities we live in. But when we look with clear eyes and we just look at the facts of cities are almost entirely residential. And so that's what we're trying to teach, is mostly residential, not entirely residential or exclusively residential, but it becomes a huge part of what's missing in our cities whenever we actually look at what is available on the ground. And that's true in downtown Conway whenever you look around here. There's very little housing in downtown. There's some new construction going on. That's great. That's a great benchmark. And I hope you're able to capitalize on it, and I hope we're able to help you do that. We also think of these kinds of things as fundamentally additive, and I want to contrast that with developments that might be extractive. When you put people and the places they live in close proximity to the places that they want to be, you get things like real increases in retail sales, real increases in disposable income because they're not spending as much money on transportation and so on and so forth. And all that translates into an additive effect for your communities. And that is a lot different than trying to put a new franchise on the corner in the same kind of place, where the entire development decision is driven by how many cars go by each day or how many sales they can expect because of the comparable in the town up the road. We're very insistent about this right here. Some people think that a good idea is enough, and that's not true. Some people think it's just enough to be excited about the right kind of development, and that's not true. It's not enough to just kind of be about the next good idea. You have to have real skills, and you have to have an incredible discipline. We preach that you should not fall in love with a development project. Okay? Love is the arena of wonderfully irrational decisions. That is a recipe for bankruptcy in development. So if you can't get the revenue for whatever reason, maybe you're not experiencing enough population growth, maybe there are too many vacant buildings, And so you can't get enough revenue for new construction to support the production costs. If you can't get the revenue, then you shouldn't tell people to go out and build the buildings. And cities that understand this fundamentally stop chasing dream projects that don't make sense. And they start trying to build up a group of people and support a group of people that understand this fundamentally and that deliver projects that are resilient. And it's that resiliency that we're really aiming for. Because a resilient neighborhood, something that's composed of a lot of different small things, means that if one place fails, because businesses go bankrupt, if one place fails, you don't lose everything. The block is still active, right? Big developments, and I'm not passing a judgment on big developments. I think big developments are an important part of our communities. They punctuate our communities in important ways. But when you put all your eggs in that basket with the development incentives or the time spent and the shepherding through the entitlement process or whatever it might be, projects like that sometimes don't even get off the ground, or they stop in the middle of construction, or they can't get the rents after the fact and they can't get the leasing velocity right. And when projects like that fail, you lose an entire block. So there's a big difference between small and large, and this thing is what drives that idea. So I want to show you a little bit about some of the curriculum, just some of the principles that we teach in the curriculum, and that we'll cover in the workshop. And I'll go through these kind of quick because what I really want to show you is what comes after this, which is some of the case studies. We teach this. Some people think, that it really is just enough to talk about how to do fine-grained development, but you actually have to teach people that they need to control one of these things. And if somebody wants to be a small developer, their job is to acquire each one of these things, not in any particular order, but to acquire each one of these things. And with every one of these things that becomes associated and done in a project, the risk goes down. And talking about risk and defining risk and teaching people how to mitigate risk is really fundamental to what we're talking about. That's what this is about. It's about risk. This is the very first principle of risk management. The second principle is you add value to your project by reducing risk, and every single one of these things reduces the risk to the project. Is anybody in here, if I ask you to imagine yourself about asking somebody to make a $250,000 investment in an idea that you have, do you feel a little nervous? Anybody? Just a little nervous about that? We don't think you should be nervous. We think it's natural to be nervous, but you don't need to be nervous. Nobody in this room is waiting until they have enough of the right kind of plywood stacked up in their backyard to do a deal. And you don't need to wait until you've got enough money stacked up in your own bank account to do a deal either. Capital for projects is just like any other building component or project component. There are different kinds of plywood, there are different grades of plywood. Some plywood is for subflooring, some plywood is for fine furniture, and there's a whole spectrum of things in between. Plywood can be structural, it can be aesthetic. There are similarly a lot of different kinds of money. There's personal debt, there's a loan from your friends and family, there's relying on your own home equity, there's going out and getting a residential mortgage or commercial mortgages, there are sharks who are going to lend hard money at high interest rates. And any one of those kinds of money could be right for your project, and maybe several kinds of the types of capital could be necessary or right for your project. We try to teach people how they can move past that nervousness by understanding that money is just something that has to be specified. And if you know that, and if you have an ecosystem that understands that and can help support people who understand that, you might start to have the beginnings of something that is sustainable, something that isn't just a one-off. So we teach people how to pitch too, because people get nervous about pitching. To us, pitching is a series of conversations that become less and less hypothetical over time. It starts out with this really simple question. It's just, if I could do X, Y, or Z, would you be able to do A, B, or C? If I could get this land under contract for X and be able to build it for this amount of money and get this much rent, would you be willing to put $25,000 in? Yes or no. If they tell you no, that's a great answer because you just wanted an answer so you could move on. This stuff doesn't have to be complicated. In fact, small development seems complicated. Development in general is kind of complicated. but it doesn't have to feel like it's insurmountable. Whenever we do our workshops, we try to be really clear with everyone that there's no such thing as a formula for success in development. There are quite a few formulas for failure, but there's no clear formula for success. And if somebody goes through our workshop and they come out the other side of it and they say, you know what, I think I can do this, and now I know who I need to reach out to and what kinds of questions to ask, to us that is a great success in a community. Because most people who walk around the communities and say, somebody ought to do this on this property, feel like they can't. And I think the most 7 dangerous words for any city are, we can't do that. We can't do that in our city. And there's a corollary there. I think some of the most dangerous words for us as people, as individuals, have such incredible capacity for accomplishing great things, especially when we work together, is there's no way I could ever do that. And we stop ourselves before we even start. And so that's what we're trying to get people through. We talk about these skill sets. We get pretty specific, even when we're talking about how to engineer a property transaction, which is how we end our days. We do get into the technical. We do get way into the nuts and bolts. But what we're really trying to impress upon people is that you can figure this out. When I say that we talk about risk, this is one of the examples of the way we do that. It's not that projects that are more complex aren't worth it. It's that projects that are more complex are more risky and there's more to lose. And somebody who takes on a larger project, or somebody that takes on a more complicated project because there's a particular mix of tenants, or they have to assemble a bunch of different kinds of money, or the site is contaminated. It could be contaminated environmentally, it could be contaminated administratively with bad codes, right? Somebody who takes on a project like that needs to understand that when things get more complex, they become a lot more risky. So you've got a lot of people in this community that are having that fantasy that somebody ought to do something with this property fantasy. And lots of times that fantasy looks like the best kind of building that we could put out there. The kinds of buildings that we already know and love in our downtowns, right? The kinds that inspire us, the kinds that are in downtown Conway right now. Those kinds of buildings are really complex to do. Really complex to do. Especially if it's your first project. It's probably too complex for you if it's your first project. Now, the kinds of projects that inspire investment by people who have wealth that they're able to invest, that have decisions to make about whether to do stock market or bonds or the certificate of deposit or the money market account or your project or this business venture or whatever. That is a different kind of real estate development than some of the other opportunities that might be available. And you need both. And here's what I mean. Somebody who wants to build an apartment over the garage in their backyard or a house on the vacant lot next door is probably just somebody that's looking to reduce their mortgage burden. And they're not trying to get a market rate return at a certain percentage and so on and so forth. And you have a lot of opportunities like that, literally hundreds from me looking at the aerial of Conway, and maybe more than that, maybe thousands. You have a lot of opportunities like that in the city if you can unlock the potential for that by making sure your codes allow that kind of thing. And you can do that kind of thing on very easy personal debt, or maybe even a nest egg that's not even debt at all. But you can't build the kind of buildings that are inspiring to us without figuring out how to address some of that complexity, and that means more risk, and that means more chance for failure. We teach people how to read their zoning codes. Do we have any planners in the room? Couple? Yeah? One that came with me, a couple over here. Anybody for the city or works for government at all? I know I looked at the list. It seems like that maybe that's good portion of the room. How often do you work with people and they just don't have any idea how to read the code? And it's not because they're dumb, and it's not because they haven't tried. It's because if you can read your zoning code, you deserve an accreditation for it. There's something about, there's something powerful that changes in people whenever they realize that they can understand this stuff. Whenever they realize that they can understand maybe what's wrong with it, or how to use it, or how to get between the lines on it. And so we try to teach people that. And one of the ways we do that is we put them through an afternoon exercise. And what we want them to do in the afternoon exercise is, yes, there is a technical component to that. We're teaching people how to read the code. We're teaching people how to ask for a variance in the right way. We're teaching people how to run a financial analysis, do a little bit of conceptual planning. But we're also giving them an emotional lesson. So there's this yoga pose I really like. It's called the developer's pose. It goes like this. Oh my God. Why? And every project for every developer feels like that until they figure it out. And it feels like that over and over again because something is always going wrong. And it doesn't matter how beautiful the flow chart you designed at the very beginning of the project is, and how tight it is, and how proud of it you are. At every level, you're going to step in something, and you're going to have to stop, and you're going to have to clean up, and you're going to have to change your plan, and you're going to have to move on. People who think that it's going to be easy and don't understand that usually drop out. They usually quit. And hopefully they quit before they fail, because you have to understand that it takes a little bit of dedication to move through it all. When I say that codes in most places are hanging us up, this is one example. This is an example from Kalamazoo, Michigan. There's a piece of their code that affected one of their oldest places in town. It's got oldest neighborhoods. It's got a street grid. It's got the single-family houses and the duplexes and the remnant fourplexes. It's got commercial on some of the corner lots and that sort of thing. It's kind of a proper Rust Belt Midwestern kind of place. Not all that dissimilar from many of our towns in Arkansas, but the architecture is a little different. Almost all of the parcels in that community are this big. That's a 50-foot by 100-foot lot, 50 foot wide, 100 feet deep, or maybe a little bit wider. But the code, which was written and passed by their city council after the neighborhood was in existence, mandated this, that every lot had to be 7,500 square feet. We teach on a lot that is 7,100 square feet for a couple of reasons that I won't go into today, so you can ignore that. The policy to fix this problem, because if you're in government or if you're in the business of development, you know that if you've got a non-conforming lot, you can't build on it. It's unbuildable. Their stated policy, when a lot was vacant, and it was a typical lot, was to vacate the lot and get one half of the lot to the abutting property on one side, and the other half to the abutting property owner on the other side. And as a bureaucratic response, that solves all the problems. No more conforming lot. What's the tax revenue on a vacant lot? It's not very much, but it's something. What's the tax revenue on a lot that has a duplex on it? Like all the other duplexes on the street. Maybe it's $10,000 a year, or talking round numbers. What if there's 100 lots like this? How many pieces of tax revenue did the city just give up on? Okay, if it's $10,000 a parcel and there's 100 parcels, that's $1 million in tax revenue. Anybody have any idea what you could do with $1 million in tax revenue? Maybe that's staff members, maybe that's customer service, maybe that's capital improvements, maybe it's straight infrastructure, maybe it's something feel good. There's a lot of different things you can do with that. And this is one of the primary reasons that cities are struggling, is most of our neighborhoods do not generate enough tax revenue to pay for their own maintenance. And we rely, especially in Arkansas, we rely on the sales tax difference to make it up, which means our stated business model for our communities is to lose money on 90% of what makes up our cities and make it all up on the last 10% of commercial development. That wouldn't work in the private sector. It turns out it's not working for most of our cities either. That's why, if you're like any other city, you've got a list that is about 3 decades long of infrastructure improvements that you can never catch up on. That's exactly why. So we teach all these things. Soup to nuts. Everything you need to know, or at least everything you need to know what questions to ask and who to talk to get all the way through concept development and negotiating a property transaction. We follow this up with a different format, a 2-day boot camp we call it. It's a 2-day studio where we bring in a much smaller group of people. We're usually looking at 80 to 120 people for a one-day workshop, and that's in a, primarily lecture format. The two-day studio is different. What we do in the studio is we take people, maybe 24 people from the community who already have projects. They've got a property under contract, or they own property, they've thought a little bit about it, maybe they got a couple of sketches. And over the course of 2 days, we help them get the project on paper that they're going to do, and the package of paperwork they need to go pitch it to investors and pitch it to lenders. And we have lenders in the room with us, we have investors in the room with us, we have architects and so on and so forth, and everybody we need in the room with us to give them good advice. And at the end, they role play it. And the reason we do that is because you have to practice this stuff if you're going to be proficient at it. We don't think practice makes perfect, we think practice makes proficient, and that's good enough. So I want to talk to you a little bit about case studies. I'll do that by talking about the project of this guy. This is one of our founding members. Monty I'll tell you a little bit about Monty. Monty has been working in his neighborhood in Duncanville and a little bit down in Midlothian, south of Dallas, for a couple of decades now. Monty doesn't have a formal education. Used to race dirt bikes and somehow negotiated his way into development. And now he does development all the time. And if you know anything about Dallas, South Dallas is not particularly well thought of by most people who look at it from a developer's perspective of, can I make money here? In fact, South Dallas has been pretty intentionally neglected by its city leadership and its regional leadership for decades, and they're trying to fix that now. But North Dallas is very different from South Dallas. I don't want to get into that. What I want to point out is South Dallas is a place that a lot of people didn't believe in, but Monty believed in it. He lived there. And what he decided was that he was going to put down his roots there and that he was going to do developments there until he died. So he took local ownership of the problems and challenges in the community and wanted to do what he could to make it better. And this is what Monty gets. Just like oxygen and water are the reasons life was able to evolve on this planet out of the primordial chaos that existed here, this is the molecule, and hustle is the most basic element that drives development success. And development is just as chaotic. Good developers understand how to turn that chaos into success, and it's almost magic whenever somebody knows how to do it right, at least if you're an outsider perspective. To most people, real estate development is a black box, and there are two things in it. The first thing is money, and the second thing is jerks. And if you were brought up in any kind of formal planning education or municipal education or neighborhood advocacy, if you've been involved in any of those things, you might think it's your job or your community's job to extract as much of that money from possible from as many of those jerks as you can get over on. Turns out that's often not the case. Sometimes the margins are thin and they're often really risky, and you can only get that way through hustle. If you don't have the skill sets and the knowledge you need hustle to get more. If you don't have the relationships you need hustle to get more. Hustle is about not giving up. Hustle is about making sure you say to yourself, you know what, I can do this. And that's what Monty gets fundamentally. You're going to see that in just a second. What Monty did here in Duncanville, these are most of his projects. And this is Main Street in Duncanville, and I'm going to talk to you about a few of these. We call this the Find Your Farm development model, and we like to use this analogy of farming when we talk about small-scale, fine-grained development. And we try to teach people that if you're going to be a small-scale developer in your community, you need to think of yourself like a farmer. You need to find a community or a neighborhood that needs you and that you love. Okay? I love Brooklyn. Brooklyn doesn't need me. I'm not going to go be a developer in Brooklyn. Okay? I'm a developer in Fayetteville because I love Fayetteville and Fayetteville needs me. Okay? I'm committed to it. I do it because I love it. I'm very happy that I'm able to do it in a way that allows me to provide living and security for my family, but I do it because I love it, okay? I could go out and I could make wages somehow else if I needed to, but I love doing it, and I love my place, and I want to make it better. There's an element of crop rotation here, too. Each of these projects was something that was missing, and was something that was going to add back to the community and provide something that the community already wanted. Maybe they didn't know that they needed it or that they wanted it, but it wasn't there before, and it made it better whenever it happened. So these projects were not about trying to extract as much value or as many nutrients from the soil as maybe conventional developers might think of things, people who come in and then leave. Money's there to stay. He wants to be proud of it for a while. He wants these things to add up to something that's much larger than any individual project. Let's talk about a few of them. One of them was the street market. I'm going to kind of step up in intensity as we talk about these. They did the street market for a couple of reasons. One, they were talking about doing a new form-based code. Nobody kind of understood the value of having buildings close to the street and the sidewalk there and all that kind of stuff, so that's how they set up the tents. And they did before and afters of the sales in each of the tents, and before and after pedestrian counts, and they found that this actually worked a lot better, and so they used this as a precedent. Monty also needed a pipeline of tenants, and any one of these people, if they have the aspiration, and they don't need to, that's not a value judge, I'm not saying they should move into a brick and mortar, but if they have the aspirations to move into a brick and mortar business, now they've got months worth of sales data that they can show the bank. And each one of these tents costs about $150, and a weekend's worth of your time to set something like this up. Which means if you're working in a neighborhood that nobody quite believes your vision about, or if you are cash-strapped, this might be a great option to get started, to prove things, to enhance your the credit of your idea when you go talk to lenders or when you go talk to other people in the community that might be gatekeepers. This is another great incremental example. In Dallas, snow cones are really popular. This summer, I would expect snow cones in Conway would probably be just as popular. If you can put something like this on a vacant lot and a line shows up, you've proven the market for something more. This is what we mean by incrementalism. There wasn't a leap of faith. There's no leap of faith with these kinds of deals. These are just toes in the water. These are just seeing what happens. Not all redevelopment has to be glam either. This is a church that turned into a dance hall and a donut store and a salon. If you do this right, if you get the ecosystem right, there is an entire group of people you never would have thought could possibly be interested in doing this kind of work that will step forward and say, you know what, I can do that, I'm going to do that. Thank you for your support. Let's do this together. This mother-daughter team took on this project. If I remember right, I think this was like a 7-year loan. They were making the minimum improvements they needed to have a place to live that they could be proud of and happy with. And they pulled it off. These small things add up to something that is really incredible if you can get a lot of them done. One duplex doesn't make a big difference for your community, but 100 duplexes is worth a lot more to you than 200 apartments in one building. I'll show you some examples. This is not a very attractive building. I don't know if you need me to tell you that. Pretty mediocre. This is what it looks like today. Still pretty mediocre. But now there are 2 new apartments there, and there are 2 storefronts. And I think we can all agree that these are a little bit more interesting. We can certainly agree that they're more economically productive and that there's more opportunity here. Here's another example. Another very mediocre building. Most cities, a majority of their buildings are kind of mediocre or banal or very familiar at least, and there are a couple of really incredible standouts. Downtowns, especially old downtowns, have a bunch of standouts, but still a lot, they're kind of like a good mix, is like half and half, like really beautiful buildings and respectable buildings and really kind of what we could do at the time with the money we had kind of buildings. And those buildings are valuable. This is what happened. Not an incredible improvement, but a meaningful improvement. 2 apartments upstairs, New demising wall on the bottom turns it into two commercial units, so it's a little bit more flexible for leasing. So here's the point, here's the punchline. Let's do a comparison. Same street, same main street, same town, same Duncanville, same taxes, everything. This Costco site is a conventional developer's dream. Tens and tens and tens of thousands of vehicles per day on this interstate. I think 60 or 70,000. Huge site, it's already assembled, okay, there's not multiple property owners to negotiate with, et cetera, et cetera. And with the Costco project, I'm going to do an $8 million project. I expect, if I'm a developer, the city to come around and start helping me out a little bit with it and facilitating some conversation, making some introductions. Anybody who works for the city knows that you get asked all the time what you can do to help people that are doing projects like this. And when you're considering your time as an elected or an appointed official or as a staffer, it makes a lot of sense to say, I've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to take these meetings. Okay? It doesn't make a lot of sense to say, I've got a limited amount of time, I'm going to meet with everyone in the city who's doing a duplex. Right? So, this is a 17-acre site, 150,000 square feet, $8 million construction project. We want to do apples and apples, so it's about $500,000 per acre. Here's the first one I showed you. Less than 1/10 of an acre, 3,500 square feet. It's worth about $6 million per acre. Second one, $4 million per acre. A little bit bigger than the one just before it. The reason is because on that 0.16 acres, almost all of it is used for real activities. On this side, almost all of it is used for storage. Storage is not very valuable. It might be a necessity for Costco for them to be successful, but it's not particularly valuable to the city. On top of this, I've got about 50 feet of infrastructure to maintain on each of these, and here I've got about a half mile, 3/4 mile worth of infrastructure to maintain. But I'm not getting anywhere near the revenue I need to be able to do it. And you might say, well, Matthew, this has sales tax dollars associated with it. But the thing is, I need toilet paper whether I get it from Costco or anywhere else. And I need food and calories whether I get it from Costco or anywhere else. So the sales tax thing is almost a wash. I've still got to buy the same things. And I'll buy them wherever I can get them, wherever is most convenient for me to get them. So if you've got a vacant piece of property in your downtown, you might look at this and you might say, where's my $6 million per acre equivalent on that vacant piece of property? It's missing because that property isn't being developed for a particular reason. And it's probably not because of the market. There's a good chance it's because it's contaminated by your own codes. This is my project. I'm also a developer in Fayetteville. This is my project. Hoping to get this open this week, maybe next week. This is 9 apartments, a tap room, a health food bar, and a couple of offices. And this is the site before. This is what we think it's going to be worth whenever it's assessed. This is a postage stamp. Okay, this project's only $1.5 million. But in terms of tax revenue, it's incredibly productive. What happens if you have another 50 of these in your community? If you can just build 50 of these kinds of projects over the next 5 years, what happens to your community? Well, what could you do with another $1 million every year? We talk about this because this opportunity has been either ignored or not. Maybe it's because it hasn't been taught, or maybe it's because we've assumed that the price tag associated with large properties is actually the real number that we should care about. But what we should really care about is what it's producing year over year. So here's a little comparison. I got 2 donut shops up on the board. The one on the left we're all familiar with. The one on the right's a local deal. They've both mastered the extremely difficult art of frying dough and brewing not so great coffee. They're essentially identical businesses. The difference is, with this one, almost all of the money it generates, except for the wages it pays, leaves the community. The one on the right, almost all the money it generates, stays with the community because the ownership is local. And even if the local ownership is making a ton of profit, they're spending a lot higher percentage of that in their local community than the franchise owners who are out of state. When Monty does these projects, he puts those owners on a lease-to-own arrangement so they can never be priced out if they stick with them long enough. 10 years in, if they've leased it for 10 years and they've been a successful business the whole time, they have a right to buy it. And once they own it, they can never be priced out. They could choose to sell it, right? But that's an optionality thing. That's not a being forced out thing. When we talk about what this means for cities, it's really hard to overstate two things. Both the depth of the kind of trouble we're in. There's a reason those infrastructure maintenance lists get longer every year. We can't catch up. And the game we play of trying to do a $100 million bond issue and then a $200 million bond issue the next decade and then so on and so forth, and it keeps growing, is a literal pyramid scheme. We're using that debt to accomplish projects, and we can never complete the list. And many of those projects on that list that we can never complete are absolutely critical and becoming more critical all the time. The only way to solve this is to change the way we're getting revenue. So this is really kind of serious stuff, okay? It's not just about having a good place to get a beer or a place to get a sandwich and a salad and share a meal with a friend. Those things are essential for cities. Okay, there's something deeply personal, maybe even spiritual about living in a city like that. There are deep effects for each of us as individuals and as families when we have a city that is that kind of healthy. But there are also incredibly important and positive ramifications for our budgets, for the bottom line, if we can restore the way we used to build cities. The way we used to build cities was one more story at a time and one more block at a time. And we built the new infrastructure with the tax revenue we already had because that was the only option available to us. You didn't have a Wall Street bond market trying to convince you as a mayor to take them on as underwriters. Okay? That's kind of a modern thing. And it's a necessity for us today because we're not generating enough tax revenue year over year that we need to keep up with maintenance. Cities and neighborhoods that are built like this came through the recession just fine. And that's a kind of unique thing. Most of the other neighborhoods didn't. Okay, we're coming to the end, so I want to go through this kind of quickly with some of the examples of how Duncanville got started on the municipal side. I showed you what Monty did. This is kind of the last thing I want to show you that Monty did. This was a bunch of people who wanted bike lanes. They met at their Chamber of Commerce in the conference room because if you ask to use a conference room at a Chamber of Commerce, that's one of the things they do. And they used Microsoft Word to design a logo. And they said, this is who we are. No, we haven't filed a nonprofit or anything like that. We just want these bike lanes. That turned into this. Everybody's seen a master plan like this. Everybody's got a master plan or ordered it or written one. Knows that the first 20 or 30 pages are kind of the same. You know, like we're going to improve quality of life and walkability and so on and so forth. And the last 30 pages are kind of the same. And they all start out, recruit developers. And that's all well and good if you can. But you only can if your market's already super hot. Otherwise, you're going to have locals build things. And we all know the punchline of the master plan is the watercolor. I love watercolors. Okay, I absolutely adore them. And I love the function they have, which is to inspire us to build something different in our cities, to get us away from that idea of we can't do that in our city. But going from this to this is decades of work by a lot of people, and nobody from outside your community that sees this is going to say, I can build this on day one. Right? There are no comparables. It did result in some meaningful improvements. This is the kind of infrastructure cities should do to stimulate new development, right? You have this massive 6-lane arterial, 50, 60 mile an hour road. You have these main street businesses that are virtually failing, hanging on by a thread. So they put in a parking slip lane and they make things a little bit prettier. It feels safer, okay? The walks feel more comfortable. You can visit these stores and it doesn't feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere. It's a very meaningful thing. Retail sales went up. Wages went up. Tax revenue went up. So that's the right kind of infrastructure investment. This is one of the other projects Monty did. This one had a direct subsidy from the city because they were so desperate to implement that watercolor vision, right? And this project, which Monty developed, happened before all the others. They didn't have comps. They needed a developer. The developer says, I can't do a project like this, it's too risky. The only way I can do a project like this and justify it to a lender is if you put this much money in. The town said, okay, we want this development to happen, we're going to do it. Monty was going to do all those other projects anyway, because those projects made sense, because they were just the next most intense thing he could do. Just one notch up on the dial. This is like 10 notches up on the dial. If they had waited until those other projects were completed, if they had just done this and waited, Monty didn't need the subsidy. It was wasted money on the city's part. Now, it's still useful, okay, and they started to recoup it, but they're recouping it because of all the other things that have happened around it, things which were on their way to happening anyway. And so I think we have to be really careful when we talk about what kind of subsidies we want to put out there. We have to be really careful when we talk about how we sequence neighborhood developments, because achieving this watercolor requires a sequence of things to happen. This is where the industry is in the top right. Everything's master planned, everything's corporate. Nothing happens in the top left or the bottom right. That just doesn't make sense. You don't do bootstrapped financing with a master plan. Everything we're talking about is in the bottom left. It's small, and it's based on an economy of means, not an economy of scale. Okay, this is how the industry works right now. This is what the industry is struggling with. If I have to have a team of land use lawyers, I need hundreds of units so I can spread their costs across every unit. I can't afford that with a small project, so I have to think about means. I have to generalize myself instead of specializing myself because I don't have enough money in the project to hire a professional for every particular part. Big projects have a lot of citizen opposition. Small projects seem a little bit more familiar. I'm not saying there's no opposition. When the market crashed, the labor market also crashed, and there's incredible competition for developers to find good trades. And we talked about mismatched supply kind of at the beginning with the single-family house stuff and the way our demographics are changing. Small developers are competitively positioned against all of these things, unlike some of the big people. Very quickly with this last piece. All of this stuff I want to show you very quickly. It's hard to finance, but it's not impossible. This stuff is on friends and family. This stuff can be on your home equity line of credit. This can be on an FHA note. That's a fourplex. You can do this on a regular mortgage. We talk a lot about this at the workshop. These can be done on a regular rehab mortgage. It doesn't take special debt. This can be federally insured. These kinds of things can be done with very low risk, especially if you've already got a tenant. Most of our cities are made up with a half dozen different things repeated over and over again with slight variations. And we can think of cities like that again. This is 20 units, thereabout. It's got only 2 different types of buildings, and it's incredibly interesting to be in. There's nothing boring about this, and there's something very sociable. So our point is that if we can remember the increments of development as city makers, and I mean that both in terms of people who work for the government and people who are actually making the cities, this one next increment thing might really be something that catches on again for us in modern times. And we believe that so strongly because that's exactly how all of our cities were built. This is exactly how all of our cities were built. They did not leapfrog themselves. They did the very next most justifiable thing. The last thing that we teach, and it's probably the most important thing, is you have to know why you do this. You have to know why you would do this. Tax revenue is a great thing to talk about, okay? Profit motive is a great thing to be able to achieve, okay? But there has to be something deeper because you got that developer's emotional roller coaster coming through on every project. And if you're a planner, you're experiencing the same thing with every city council vote that doesn't go your way, right? You have to know why, or you quit. And you have to know why as a community, or your community quits, and you stop thinking that you can achieve it. So if you're going to attend the workshop, I challenge you, try to think about this particular thing. Why is it you think this might be important for your community? And if you can figure that out, and if you can talk to other people about it, you might have a really darn good chance of pulling some of this kind of stuff off. But without it, then you might really not be able to do it in your city.